So this week we read Parshas Behaloischa, and the sugya we will be discussing today is one of the fascinating and fundamental sugyas, Osek b'mitzvah potor min mitzvah. So in this week's parsha we learn about Pesach Sheni, and the story the Torah tells us, Vayehi anoshim asher hayu tmeim lenefesh adam v'lo yochlu lasois haPesach b'yom hahu. ויקרבו לפני מוישה ולפני ההרם ביום ההוא ויאמרו אנושים והמו אנחנו טמאים לנפש אדם למה ניגורא לבלתי הקרב את קורבן השם במו ידוי בסורך בני ישראל. Why should we lose out? So the Gemara says in Masechet Sukkot Daf Chaf Hey, who are those people and why were they Tmei mace? Why did they expose themselves to Tumas mace? Three different opinions. Yesh oimrim noise aroin shel Yosef. Those were the people carrying the aroin with the body of Yosef Atzadik to bring him to Eretz Yisrael lekvuro, as Yosef Atzadik asked them to do. So they were Osek b'mitzvah. Another opinion is they took care of Nodav Avihu, Shnei b'nei Aharon. And then the Gemara says, Meis mitzvah. And this is one of the two sources from which Chazal learn Osek mitzvah potam and a mitzvah. And because they were engaged in a mitzvah, they were potter from Korban Pesach. The Gemara brings another source, another drosha. B'shivtechu b'veisechu uvelechtecho v'derech uvelechtecho leches didecho v'lo lechet shel mitzvah. This is source number 2. And the Gemara explains tzrichusa. Tarvayu tzrichi. We need both sources. If it would only be the pasuk in this week's parsha, Vayehi anoshim asher hayu tmeim lenefesh adam, we would say the mitzvah of Meis mitzvah, and the mitzvah they were engaged with was far before Erev Pesach. So when they were Mekayim the mitzvah, the second mitzvah was still irrelevant. It wasn't Nogeya. Maybe only in that case do we say Osek b'mitzvah potam mitzvah, but not when both mitzvahs are upon the person in the very same time zone. On the other hand, if we would only have the pasuk in Kriya Shema, uvelechtecho v'derech, we would say, how do we know that Osek b'mitzvah potar afilu b'mitzvah chamura sheyesh b'koros? There are only two mitzvahs to say that have koros, Pesach and Milah. So maybe Pesach, because it's such a harsh mitzvah, such an important one, Oynish Koros, we do not say Osek mitzvah potam and a mitzvah, and that is why we need both sources. The fundamental question in this sugya of Osek mitzvah potam and a mitzvah, is it dechuyo or hutro? So let me explain the concepts, hutro and dechuyo. In Shas we find these concepts, these words, only in one context. Korbanos tzibur. Shekrevim betumo, tumahutra betzibur, or dechuyo betzibur. And that's a few different sources in Shas, Psochim Yume, and in other places. And the nafkamane is, if we say dechuyo, then we need to try to minimize the tumah and make every effort to bring the korban b'taharo. But if we say tumahutro betzibur, then it's a far broader leniency, and you don't even need to make an effort to be makriv the korban b'tahara. So as I explained, is the only source in Shas in which Chazal bring up the question, hutro or dechuyo. But we find this discussion by Pikuach Nefesh and Shabbos. And in my Svorim, in many sources, in the Chuvas, in Minchas Osher ala Torah, I dealt with great length in the question, Shabbos, hutro, etzel, pikuach nefesh, or dechuyo. Asay doiche lo isese. Definitely dechuyo. That's the lotion of the Gemara. Asay doche lo taase. Meleches zeichel nefesh b'yamtev. Definitely hutro. So we find these concepts in 4 different sugyas, as I explained, but there are more than 4. Milah b'Shabbos. Machlokes b'Yosef in Ramo. In Hilchos Milah. But the common denominator, tzadishov, of all these sources is, when a mitzvah say comes against the lo ta'aseh, our sugya, Osek mitzvah potam mitzvah, is different. We're dealing with 2 mitzvahs asay, 2 positive precepts. But still, the fundamental idea would be the same. Is oisek b'mitzvah potem and a mitzvah like an oines? It's a doichak, or is it a blank and broad leniency, as if he is be'etzem potor from the other mitzvah? B'shkuf Rishonim, we would argue that's a machlokes Tosfos and the Ran. Tosfos Sikochov says, Ef shelakayim shneim oisek b'mitzvah eineno potor min ha-mitzvah. It is only when you cannot be makayim both mitzvahs, and you already started with one. It is only then that we say oisek mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah. But if you could be makayim both, that is your obligation to do them both. The Rosh and the Ritva agree with Tosfos. The Ran disagrees, and the Ran is the Yud Aleph in the Dapim of the Rif in Masechet Sukkah. The Ran says, "Afilu hamef shelakayim shnayim oisek mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah." I just want to bear in mind, Asay doicha lo ta'aseh, in Yevamos Daf Hey, and in many other sources in Shas, we learn Reish Lakish, Ef shelakayim shnayim ein esed doicha lo ta'aseh. I mentioned before, esed doicha lo ta'aseh is dechuya. It is there that we first learn Ef shelakayim shnayim. You need to do them both, and that would support the idea, or the mahalach, or the understanding, that Tosfos' opinion is based on the assumption that oisek mitzvah poter mitzvah is a gather of dechuya, and therefore, ef shelakayim shem, you need to perform both. The Ran maybe would maintain hutra, and that is why even if ef shelakayim shneim, oisek mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah, Tosfos proves his point. Would we say that a person that's wearing tefillin or tzitzis is exempt poter makol ha-mitzvah shebetoira? Ridiculous. If he's wearing tefillin, he's poter mekriya shema, poter metefillah, poter memezuzah, poter makol ha-mitzvah shebetoira. So this proves ef shelakayim shneim, you need to do them both. The Ran says no. When you're wearing tefillin or tzitzis, you're not a oisek b'mitzvah at all. Oisek b'mitzvah means you're engaged. It is only a mitzvah that demands ma'asim, it demands acts, it demands your physical engagement. But the fact that you are wearing tefillin or tzitzis doesn't render you an oiseg b'mitzvah. That is the approach of the Ran. And the Ran is not a das yochid, or Zerua Sukkah Reish Tzadik Tes, the son of the great Or Zerua, Tshuvas Malach Or Zerua Yosef and Kuf Pei Gimel. They are in the same opinion of the Ran. So many times I explain to my Talmidim, in yeshivas, it is customary, it is the minig, every chakir, every suffolk, every mechlokes we have, to assume that it depends on the fundamental halacha, on the most basics of shorish sugya. But in most cases, that is not correct. Most of the sveikas and machlokes are nuances, in dakus, in the details, not necessarily in the fundamentals. And Netias Libi Oimeli, that the machlokes between Tosfos and Ran is not necessarily in the most basic interpretation of oisek b'mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah. Is it b'doichak or b'shofi? Is it dechuya or hutra? But rather in the details. Oisek b'mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah has two sources. This week's parsha, Shivtecho b'veisecho uvelechtecho v'derech. I think the machlokes is, what are the limits? What are the boundaries? Do we broaden the scope of this halacha or not? Is it only be'ef shelakayim shnayim or even be'ef shelakayim shnayim? The Rit was a yochid that goes to the extreme and says, oisek b'mitzvah not only is poter from the other mitzvah, it's an isur as well. According to the Ritva, this concept of oisek mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah is similar to bizui mitzvah. It is not the covet when you're engaged in a mitzvah, you just cut it off and move on to different activities. Even if those different activities are another mitzvah, you don't stop when you're in the middle of kiyum ha-mitzvah. And according to the Ritva, it is an isur as well. Which brings us to a fundamental question. Oisek b'mitzvah poter min ha-mitzvah. But if he does perform that additional mitzvah, the other one, is he yoitza or not? Because at the end of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara says when a person performs a mitzvah, when he's poter, he's not yoitza with that mitzvah. So the example we have in the end of Rosh Hashanah Chof Ches is Leil HaSeder. Before a person came to matzah, he had a manic attack. and he just lost his mind. And he was in a psychotic state. And it is then that he ate matzah. He calmed down and he came back to normalcy. Maybe in the schus of matzah, who knows? Was he yotzeh matzah? Or would we say when he ate matzah he wasn't in a proper state of mind? He had a din of a shoita, which is poter min mitzvahs. And the Gemara says he was not yotzeh and he needs to eat another kazayas matzah after he calms down and comes back to a healthy state of mind. So how would we deal with Osek mitzvah poter min mitzvah? Would we say it is as if he's not a bar chiyuva and he's not yotzeh at all the other mitzvah, or would we say he's yotzeh? This is a question raised by the Mishnah Berurah Tov Ayin Hey Sharatzi and Sif Koten Lamed Tes. And the Mishnah Berurah makes somewhat of a compromise, and he says, Osek b'mitzvah poter min mitzvah, but he is yotzeh that other mitzvah. Because after all, he's a bar chiyuva. It's just a technicality that when he performs one mitzvah, he is poter from another. But he's a bar chiyuva, and therefore he's yotzeh. However, he should not say a brocha. Because how could he say vitzivonu if he's not mitzvah? And to me, it always was a pella. And why doesn't the Sharatzion say that this depends on the Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos? And the Machlokes Beis Yosef and the Ramonsim and Yud Zayin Beit Tzitzis, whether Noshim, women, could say a brocha on mitzvahs to say Shazman Garama, because Noshim are exempt from those mitzvahs. And that's a Machlokes that Ramon says yes, the Beis Yosef says no. It's a Machlokes Rashi and Bali and Tosfos. So obviously the Mishnah Berurah would argue, Osek b'mitzvah poter min mitzvah gorat fei. And maybe even according to the Ramah that a woman could say, but this is different. Hard to explain why. Rit for Nerev in Sadik Vav Omed Aleph, we find the opposite. And he says, even according to the Rishonim, that women could not say a brocha because they cannot say vitzivanu, but Osek b'mitzvah could. And why could he? Because, after all, he's a bar chiyuva. Like I mentioned before, Lagabi Yetzias Yedei Choyve. This person is chayiv. It is just a technicality. It is right here and now because you're engaged with another mitzvah that you're poter, and therefore one could say a brocha. Question number 3. Osek b'mitzvah, poter min mitzvah, so we didn't daven. Does he need to daven tefillas tashlumin? That's a machlokes Shach and Taz. Not in Orach Chaim, but rather in Yoredei Shin Mem Aleph and Hilchos Avelus. Shin Mem Aleph, Siv Beis, we learn in Shulchan Aruch. And Oinein poter min tefillah. And he does not need to daven tashlumin after Kvuras HaMeis. Tashlumin is only for an Oineis, but not for an Oinein, because an Oinen is potu. Comes along the Drisha, Shin Mem Aleph, and he says, Osek b'tzorchet tzibur has the same din as an oinen. You're not chayiv in tashlumin. The Taz disagrees in Sif Koten Hey. And the Taz says, Osek b'tzorchet tzibur is like an osek b'mitzvah. Osek b'mitzvah is like an oines. He is chayiv b'tashlumin. He's not like an oinen, which Chachamim pattered across the board. Shach Nekudas HaKesef agrees with the Drisha. And he says, Osek b'mitzvah is like an oinen. So this clearly is the machlokes. Is it hutro? Is it a general leniency is poto? Or is it only bedoichak, like the chuyo? You're chayiv in the other mitzvah. You just can't do it because you're engaged in mitzvah number 1. So this is clearly a machlokes between the Drisha and the Shach on one hand and the Taz on the other. One of the interesting and fundamental questions dealt with Achronim is, Osek b'mitzvah derabanan, is he poter from a mitzvah diuraisa? The Oroch Lenero brings up this question in Sukkah Daf Chof Hey. Rabbi Chona Wasserman, in his form in 2 different sources, discusses this question, and he doesn't quote the Oroch Lenero. Kovetz Shulam Chelik Beis Siman Amid Beis, Kovetz Ha'oras Al Yevomes Siman Mem Aleph. And he wants to prove from Menachas Ayin Beis, and that's a beautiful tzushtel, a beautiful raya. Menachas Ayin Beis, we learn the halachas, you cannot partake from the new crop of wheat, of grain, before bringing Shtelach and Shavuos. You cannot cut the wheat from the field before the Korban Oimar in Pesach. However, if the Ktsira is Ktsir Mitzvah, it is permissible. Why? Uvekutzerachem, Ktsira Shalochem, and not Ktsira Shal Mitzvah. Rabbi Elchanan argues, what is the difference between Ktsira Shalochem and Leches Didach, Alicha Shalochem? It's the same. And if in Menachos Ayin Beis we learn, even a mitzvah that Rabbanon is permissible before Ktsiras Uoima, same would apply to a mitzvah that Rabbanon regarding the din of Oisik b'mitzvah, potam and mitzvah. I do not think Rabbi Elchanan brings that this is actually a machlokes between the Mogen Avraham, the Pri Megadim, and Siman Ayin Beis and Shulchan Aruch Chaim. Ayin Beis and Aruch Chaim, we learn the din. Koivre Meisim are potam mit tefillah v'mekriya shema because Oisik b'mitzvah potam and mitzvah. We're not dealing with relatives. It's not dine avelis and dine aninos, but rather Oisik b'mitzvah. We're dealing with kavronim. That's their job. They're not related to the nifta. But Oisik mitzvah potam and mitzvah. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, and the Ramah, they finished the Kvura. And now the minig is to make a shura in the basic Kvuras, and the people are menachem avelim. If they didn't make the shura yet, and they didn't start nichum avelim, then they need to check, do we have enough time to do the nichum and we'll still have time for Kriya Shema? Or if we do the nichum, we're going to lose Zman Kriya Shema. However, if they started the shura, and they started with nichum avelim, even if they're going to lose out Kriya Shema, they should not be mafsik, because oisik b'mitzvah potam and mitzvah. That is what the Mogen Avraham Sif Koden Dalet is medayik from the Ramah. And the Pri Megadim and Eshel Avraham disagrees, and he says, Nichum Avelim is only a mitzvah derabanan. How would it override Kriya Shema D'Oraisa? So to me it is clear, the Mogen Avraham would respond, that is the din of oisik b'mitzvah potam and mitzvah. It's not a gather of the chuyo. Even a mitzvah kana potam and mitzvah chamura. And that is what we learn from this parsha. Vehi anosham ashur hayut meim lenefesh odem. The Gemara says the revusa is that he's even potter from Korban Pesach, which is kores. So if a mitzvah say is doichem, mitzvah say sheyesh b'kores, the same would apply to a mitzvah derabanan. Not necessarily, but maybe, perhaps, like we learn in Menachos Ayin Beis. So I think the Mogen Avraham is right, and it's diak from the Ramah. Lo kedivra Pri Megadim. Even an oisik mitzvah derabanan would be potter from a mitzvah d'oraisa. Coming back to the very first point we discussed in today's Shia, Efshar lekayim shneim. I just want to point out that this machlokes between Tosis and the Ran, Efshar lekayim shneim, is mechuyev to perform both mitzvahs, is not only a svara ba'alma. All the chidushim in this sugya are based on a fundamental question that the Rishonim ask. What is the ravusa that oisig b'mitzvah potam and mitzvah? Isn't it a milsa de pshita? Why would a person stop in the middle of one mitzvah to be mekayim another? So we have 4 tirutzim on this kasha. According to the Ran, answer is very simple. The revusa is afal pisha efshar lekayim shneim oisig mitzvah potam and mitzvah. Menasvora, we would say, if you could do them both, why not do them both? Kamash malan oisig b'mitzvah potam and mitzvah. The Ritva responds, the revusa is, not only are you potter, it's an isser. Menasvora, we would say, mashi yirtzeh. You could be mekayim mitzvah number 1 or decide to stop and go to mitzvah number 2. Kamash malan, that it's an isser. What would Tosfos say? Tosfos would say the chiddush, the revusa is even a oisik b'mitzvah kala potam b'mitzvah chamura, mitzvah derabanan potam b'mitzvah d'oraisa. Or another chiddush, oisik b'mitzvah she'eino oiveres patur b'mitzvah oiveres, like nicham avelim against Kriya Shema. Nicham avelim we could do in another 10 minutes. We could prefer reciting Kriya Shema and then do nicham avelim. But if you're going to do Nichum Avelim first, you're going to lose Kriya Shema. Afal Piken Oisig Mitzvah Potam and Mitzvah. So all these Chidushim are based on how do we answer a very simple question. What's the Chiddush on the Revusa? Oisik b'mitzvah potam min ha-mitzvah. So when we deal with the question of Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim, does it necessarily mean Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim bevas achas? Or even Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim bezeh achar zeh? It would be considered Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim. And according to Tosfos, you stop the first, you makayim the second, and then you come back to the first. Mireish Havi Amina. My Mishnah Rishona was that Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim is only if you can do them both. Bevas zachas b'chod machta. But if you need to disengage from number one, that is not Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim. And then I retracted, and I saw many rayas from the Rishonim. Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim is even if momentarily we stop number one, we're makayim number two because we might lose it. It's a mitzvah veres, and then we could go back to number one without tirchi yasera. That still would be defined as Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim. So the Beis Yosef in Simalamet Ches says, Kais vei tefillin v'mezuzas p'turin mikriyas shema oisig b'mitzvah potam min ha-mitzvah. The Beis Yosef says, it is only if I'm in the middle of writing tefillin and mezuzas for a person and he's leaving town. And if I'm going to say Kriyas Shema, he won't have time to wait. And he will leave without the mezuzah and without the tefillin. It is only then that we say, Oisig b'mitzvah potam min ha-mitzvah. But if we have no reason to worry, and then he definitely should stop in the middle of writing, say Kriyas Shema, and then go back to his writing, and the Beis Yosef says, that is Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim. L'madem edvorov. Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim shel afi shitas HaTosfos chayiv, lav davka Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim bevas achas b'chod ha-machta. And this would be my understanding in a very fundamental question. Dinei hefsek b'tefillah. These are long and complicated sugyas. Bein ha-prokim, b'toch ha-perek, where we are mafsik and for what we are mafsik. Kadesh Kedusha. There's a difference, Kodesh and Borach, or the entire Kedusha. Sometimes we won't be mafsik for every Yomei. We won't be mafsik for Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemoy. So, Dina Hefsik are complex. But my question is, why would we ever need to be mafsik? Why would we say, Oisig mitzvah potam min ha-mitzvah? Person is in the middle of Psukkah de Zimra, in the middle of Haidu, before Baruch She'omar. But why would he need to be mafsik for Kaddish and Kedusha? Oisig mitzvah potam min ha-mitzvah. Shtei tshuvas v'davar. One answer is, and this is a very profound thought, I think in mitzvah shebedibur b'chlal there is no din of oisig mitzvah potam min ha-mitzvah. And the reasoning, the rationale is, all the mitzvahs shebedibur fundamentally boil down to the same point. La'ovde b'chol havav chemeiz avodah shebelev. So avodah shebelev has many manifestations. Sheva, choidoye, bakosha, different brochas. They all, at the end of the day, are brochas. Tehillas Hashem yada b'pi, whether it's berchas shevach, berchas choidoye, berchas mitzvah, berchas hanan. And therefore, when we're mafsik, it's not as if you're stopping one mitzvah, going to another. They're all the same. Even Kriyas Shema, which is different, stands apart. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa. But what is the essence of Kriyas Shema? Kabbalas ol malchus shamayim, that is avodah sukeil. And therefore, all the mitzvahs shebedivur, the halacha of oisik mitzvah potam mitzvah will never apply, because they're all fundamentally the same idea, the same thought, the same yesod. The other approach would be, this is considered Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim. If you need to stop for a second, or 10 seconds, or 15 seconds, and then you're back to mitzvah number one, that is Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim. And most poskim maintain, Ef Shel HaKayim Shnayim, you're chayev kishitas HaTosfos. I once read a story that told us of the Chofetz Chaim. There was a rabbinical conference, a meeting, in Poland or in Russia. And the Chofetz Chaim was addressing the Tzibur. And it was very close to Sofzman Mincha. One of the Rabbonim got up, banged on the table, and said, Mincha. Chofetz Chaim was taken aback. And he responded by saying, we've come together to be Osek B'tzorchet Tzibur, not to daven. And there was a big commotion and confusion. Reb Chaim Oizer got up and he said, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. Both Rabbonim are right. The Chofetz Chaim shekol ma'asov l'shem Shemayim potem min ha-mitzvah, Osek b'tzorchet mitzvah, potem mikriya Shema, kal v'choyim min ha-tefillah. But that other Rav, maybe he is not always l'shem Shemayim, so he was right by saying we need to daven mincha. So what's the basis of this story? Rambam Perik Beis Melchas Kriya Shema, Osek b'tzorchet tzibur, potem min ha-kriya Shema. Why? Tzorchet tzibur is Osek b'mitzvah. Kesef Mishnah quotes Rabbeinu Menoach. Rabbeinu Menoach says, it is only im kavanos l'shem Shemayim. It is only then that he's potem min ha-kriya Shema. And the Kesef Mishnah wonders, Osek b'mitzvah, never do we find by Osek b'mitzvah makes a difference whether he's l'shem Shemayim or not. A mitzvah is a mitzvah at the end of the day. And I say, Osek b'tzorchet tzibur is different. There are so many shlichet tzibur, and some of them that I know. It's all about their career, their prestige, their status, their fame, their power, their money. These people are not oskim b'tzorchet tzibur, they are oskim b'tzorchet atzmam. Sometimes the tzibur is ne'ene. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But they're not busy with the tzibur, they're busy with their own career, with power and money. Those are not potem min ha-mitzvahs. That would be my interpretation of Rabbeinu Menoach, and that's what Reb Chaim Oizer said. So, as I apologized before, the kuntres that we send out every week has 10 times as much material than what I could share with you in this short shiur. So if you want to learn this sugya at greater depth, then please go through the kuntres or Minchas Klonei HaMitzvos. Just one short thought, the beginning of the Pasha, Ba'alois Chos HaNeiros. Rashi writes, Chol Shudato Shel Aaron, Mishum Shelo Haya B'Chanukas HaMizbeach. Kodesh Baruch Hu tells him, Shelcho Godol Mishelo Hem Sha'ato Meita V'Madlakas HaNeiros. So why is that greater than Chanukas HaMishkan? Ad shloishe dvorim b'olam ha'omed, al ha'torah, al ha'avodah, v'al gemilas chasodim. It is clear that these three are equally important. And it is only the combination of the three that is kiyumay shaloilam and shleimus ha'adam. In a personal conversation many years ago with the Nesiv Shalom with the Slonim Rebbe, we had a very close relationship. I once heard from him a vort. It's a vort. Al shloishe dvorim b'olam ha'omed. It's very easy to count to 3. Why is it so important? Then Chazal say, Al shloishe dvorim ha'olam ha'omed. Why can't Chazal simply say, Hu olam ha'omed al ha'torah al ha'avodah v'al gemilas chasodim? So we said, if a table has 4 legs, or a chair has 4 legs, one breaks off. It's very uncomfortable, but the table could still stand. The chair could still stand. Don't lean on the wrong side, but it could still stand. But if it had 3 legs to begin with, and one broke off, then it cannot stand. So Chazal mean to plead with us, Al shloishe dvorim ha'olam ha'omed. It is only 3, it's not 4, so be careful. So these 3 are equally important. Keneged Torah avodah gemilas chasodim, we have shloishe kelim in the Mikdash, menorah, mizbeach, and shulchan. Everybody could understand. Menorah is indicative of Torah. Kiner mitzvah v'Torah. The mizbeach is avodah. Avodas HaKarbonos and Avodas HaTefillah are the same. In Brochas Chavov we learn Tefillah is keneged Karbonos Tiklum. And the Shulchan is Gemilas Chasodim and Achnos HaSorchim, as we learn in the end of Masechet Chagiga. However, the Zohar says, Al shloishe dvorim, but the central pillar is Torah. Avodah and Chesed from right and left, miyamin u'mismoil. So in Minchas Osher I wrote, in the Heichel, where the practical avodah was performed, there are three kelim. Menorah, mizbeach, shulchan. They're equally important. However, lefnai v'lefnim, kol odem lo yeh ba'oil, and that is a total concealment. What is in Kodesh HaKodeshim? One thing. Aroinu Eides, Luchas Abris, and a Sefer Torah. In there, Torah reigns supreme, and it's only Torah. And where is the Oren? Even Shasiu, Memeno Hushtat HaOlam. The world is built on the Even Shasir. That is the bedrock. And there in Kodesh HaKodeshim, only Torah. So in Pnimius, Torah has a special status, overpowering all the others. And that is why Kodesh Baruch Hu tells Aaron, you should not be dismayed. Have no chalishas adas. They brought korbanos. Shalcha godel mishaloim. Sha'ato meitav umad lekesaneros. So in our practical avodah, the three are equally important. Torah, avodah, and chesed. But let us not forget the fundamental importance of Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah keneged kulam, Talmud Godel, shetalmud meivere demaisa. We should always have the schus to learn Torah, to teach Torah, b'simcha v'betuv leva. And the schus of Torah we should be zoicha b'korov to Yeshuas Yisrael, bias Mashiach tzidkenu, b'mheru v'yomeinu, amen.